The moment Judge Edgar Boone smiled, that slow, cold smile, while tightening the noose around a half-conscious woman's neck, every person in Black Hollow looked away. Every single one. 5 children were on their knees in the frozen mud, screaming. The crowd stood in silence. Not one man moved, not one woman stepped forward. They had all decided that today, a mother would die for a crime she never committed, and they would watch and say nothing and go home for supper like it never happened. That was the moment Silas Granger raised his rifle. And that was the moment everything changed. If this story already has your heart pounding, you're in the right place. Subscribe to this channel right now and follow every chapter with me until the end, because I promise you, what happens next will shake you. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The town of Black Hollow wasn't the kind of place that appeared on any decent map. It sat wedged between 2 limestone ridges in the wind-scraped heart of Wyoming territory, the kind of settlement that had grown up fast and ugly around a single sawmill and a single man's ambition. The buildings leaned. The street was nothing but frozen ruts and horse manure and the occasional frozen puddle that would crack under your boot and soak you to the ankle. There was a general store, a livery, a saloon with a broken front window that nobody had bothered to fix for going on 2 years, and a courthouse that looked considerably more solid and permanent than anything else in town, which was exactly the point, because the man who built it wanted everyone to understand where the power lived. Silas Granger rode in from the east just after 9 in the morning, and he almost didn't stop. He'd been riding since before dawn, which was not unusual for him. Sleep had become something he did in short, untrustworthy stretches, the kind that left him more tired than when he lay down. His horse, a blue roan mare named Odessa, who had outlasted 3 of his better plans in life, was moving at the deliberate pace of an animal who had decided she was done being pushed. Silas let her set the pace. He wasn't in a hurry. He hadn't been in a hurry about anything for the better part of 4 years. He was 41 years old, and he looked it. There were lines carved into the skin around his eyes that hadn't been there when he was a marshal, and a scar along his left jawline that had never quite flattened the way the doctor said it would. He was lean in the way that men get lean when they've been doing hard work alone for a long time. Not fit exactly, just stripped down to what was necessary. He wore a canvas coat that had been good quality once, a battered hat with the brim turned down on the left side, and he carried a Winchester rifle in the saddle scabbard and a Colt on his hip out of habit more than anything else. He hadn't fired either of them in 8 months. He'd come to Black Hollow to buy a milk cow. That was the entire plan. He had 3 acres of decent pasture land behind his ranch cabin up near the Laramie foothills, and he decided somewhere around November that what the place was missing, what would make it feel less like a place where a man was simply waiting to get old and die, was a milk cow. He'd heard from his nearest neighbor, a Finnish trapper named Aino who smelled like pine resin and rarely made sense, that a man named Calvin Pratt in Black Hollow had 2 good dairy cows and was looking to sell one before the hardest part of winter set in. That was the whole reason Silas was here. A cow. That was all. He heard the crowd before he saw it. Not a festival kind of noise, not the loose, roaming sound of people enjoying themselves. This was the particular sound of a large group of human beings trying very hard not to make any sound at all, which is somehow louder than shouting. It was the sound of held breath and restrained movement, and Silas had heard it enough times in his old life that his body recognized it before his mind caught up. His hand found the stock of the Winchester without him deciding to do it. He rounded the corner past the general store and pulled Odessa up short. There must have been 200 people gathered in the open lot behind the courthouse. They were packed in tight, standing in the cold without moving, faces turned toward a wooden platform that had been built. He could see from the fresh lumber and the smell of sawdust, very recently. Not more than a day or 2 ago. On the platform stood 3 men, 2 with the look of hired muscle, thick-necked and stone-faced, wearing identical expressions of bored authority, and one in the center who was clearly not hired. This one had a full gray beard, a black coat with a fur collar, and the particular bearing of a man who had been told he was important so many times that he'd forgotten it was ever in question. Between the 2 thick-necked men stood a woman. She was not standing well. She was standing the way people stand when they are being held upright, because otherwise they would fall. Her dress was dark with cold, and what Silas recognized, even from 40 yards out, as old blood. Her face was turned down, chin against her chest. She was either unconscious on her feet or very close to it. Her wrists were bound behind her back. Around her neck, already settled there with the careful precision of someone who had done this before, was a rope. In the mud in front of the platform, 5 children knelt in a ragged line. Silas stared. The oldest couldn't have been more than 14. A boy, blond, with his hands clasped in front of him like he was praying to something he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. The others were progressively smaller. Another boy, 2 girls, and the smallest, a girl who couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 years old, was leaning against her nearest sibling's arm and crying with the exhausted, hiccuping sound of a child who had been crying for a very long time. All 5 were looking up at the woman on the platform. All 5 wore the same expression. Not hope exactly, something below hope. The thing you feel when hope has left and you haven't figured out what replaces it yet. The man in the fur-collared coat, Judge Edgar Boone, though Silas didn't know the name yet, stepped forward to the edge of the platform and raised one hand. The crowd went quieter still. "Evelyn Mercer," Boone said, and his voice carried the practiced ease of a man who had delivered many speeches and enjoyed all of them. "Having been tried and found guilty of the murder of Randall Holt, a man of good standing in this community, you are hereby sentenced to hang by the neck until you are dead. The sentence to be carried out immediately and without delay." He paused. "Let the silence do some work. May your soul receive what your crimes have earned." And he nodded at one of the thick-necked men. The man reached for the lever. Silas's rifle was already out of the scabbard. He didn't think about it. That was the honest truth of it, and it would bother him later, the fact that he hadn't thought about it, because thinking about things before doing them was how he'd managed to stay alive this long. But there are moments when the body moves and the mind comes along afterward, confused and slightly irritated, and this was one of those moments. The Winchester came up. Odessa held steady underneath him with the particular stillness of a horse that has been through worse, and Silas Granger put a bullet through the hanging rope from 40 yards out. The sound of the shot rolled across the square like a clap of thunder in a closed room. The rope snapped. The woman dropped, not far, just the few inches the rope had already held her, and hit the platform on her knees. The thick-necked man who'd been reaching for the lever stumbled backward. The crowd made a sound that was half scream and half something else, something Silas couldn't name, something that sounded like 200 people realizing simultaneously that they'd been holding their breath for longer than they knew. Silas walked Odessa forward through the parting crowd. He kept the rifle out. Boone had not moved. That was the first thing Silas noticed about him. Most men, when something unexpected happens, flinch, shift their weight, their eyes move. Boone stood exactly where he'd been standing, looking at Silas approach with an expression of such perfect stillness that it was almost impressive. Almost. "That was court-ordered," Boone said. His voice was calm, dangerously calm, in the way of still water above very fast current. "Didn't look like much of a court to me," Silas said. He reached the edge of the platform and kept his eyes moving. The 2 hired men, Boone, the crowd around him, the roof edges of the buildings at his periphery. Old habits. "Looked like a hanging. In Wyoming territory, this court has full authority to—" "I'm sure it does," Silas said. "And I'm sure you'll be happy to explain that to the territorial marshal's office." He swung down from Odessa, keeping the rifle level, and stepped up onto the platform. The woman on her knees was conscious, barely. She turned her face up toward him, and he saw that she was younger than he'd expected, maybe 32 or 3, with dark hair plastered against a face that had a fresh bruise along one cheekbone and a cut above her left eye that had dried dark. Her lips were dry and cracked. Her eyes were the particular unfocused quality of someone who had been given something, and his stomach dropped. "She's been drugged," he said. Not a question. "She was administered a mild sedative to reduce her agitation," Boone said smoothly. "A humane consideration." Silas crouched next to her and said quietly, not for the crowd, "Can you stand? If I help you?" She looked at him. Her eyes tried to focus. Something in them. Not trust. Not yet. She didn't know him well enough for trust. But recognition. The recognition of someone who has been in the dark for a long time and sees something that might possibly be light. "My children," she said. Her voice was barely there. Wrecked. "I see them," he said. "I've got you." He got her arm over his shoulder and stood up with her, turning to face Boone and the crowd and the two hired men who were both now angled toward him with their hands very close to their holsters. Silas kept his rifle in his free hand. It wasn't the most elegant position he'd ever been in. "You are interfering with the lawful execution," Boone said. "Then arrest me," Silas said. "Take it to a real judge." Something moved across Boone's face then. Not anger. Anger was too simple. It was calculation. A man running numbers, assessing, deciding. He looked at the rifle in Silas's hand, at the 200 people in the crowd who were now watching with a very different kind of attention than they'd had 5 minutes ago, and he did the math. "You don't know what you've walked into," Boone said. "No," Silas agreed. "I came to buy a cow." He walked Evelyn Mercer down off that platform with her weight against him and her 5 children rushing forward from the mud, the oldest boy reaching his mother's free hand and holding it with both of his own, the small one clinging to the hem of Evelyn's dress, all of them moving together in that stumbling, chaotic, desperate way of people who have been separated from each other and are not willing to be again. The crowd parted. Not many people met his eyes. A few of the older ones, a woman in a gray wool coat, a man with a blacksmith's build, gave him a look that was something between gratitude and apology. Most looked at the ground. Boone did not follow them. Not yet. But Silas knew, in the place in his chest that had kept him alive through 11 years of marshalling, that the judge was already giving orders to someone he couldn't see. He got Evelyn and the children to the livery at the north end of town, which was the nearest building with walls and a door that closed. The liveryman, a wiry man of about 60 with a permanent squint, took one look at the situation and wordlessly indicated an empty stall in the back. Silas settled Evelyn against the wall and knelt in front of her while the children pressed in around her, the older ones forming a kind of instinctive barrier between their mother and the rest of the world. "How long has she been like this?" he asked the oldest boy. The boy's jaw was tight. 14 years old and already carrying something too heavy for that age. "They gave her something this morning before they took her out." He swallowed. "She was trying to fight them. She was—" He stopped, started again. "She was really fighting them." "What's your name?" "Thomas." "Thomas? How long has she been in custody?" 8 days. 8 days. Silas looked at Evelyn's wrists where the rope had been. The skin there was raw and angry, which meant restraints for more than just this morning. Her feet, he noticed, were wrapped in cloth strips rather than boots. Her boots had been taken, or she'd never had them here. In late November in Wyoming. He put that information in the same place he put all the other information, and did not let his face do anything with it. "She didn't kill anybody," Thomas said. The boy's voice was flat, not defensive. The flatness of someone who has said something so many times it has worn grooves. "She didn't kill Mr. Holt. She never even—" He stopped and the flatness cracked slightly, just at the edges. "She brought him food when he was sick. She brought him food and he died, and they said it was her." "Who said?" Thomas looked at him. And here was the thing. The boy looked at him with an expression that was not what Silas expected, which would have been fear or desperation, or even the kind of reckless hope that people get when they're drowning and someone throws them a rope. What Thomas Mercer looked at him with was assessment. He was deciding something, deciding whether Silas was worth what he was holding. "Judge Boone," Thomas said finally. "He said it was her." And then, very quietly, so quietly that even the children pressed close might not have caught it. "Because Mr. Holt was going to tell people what Boone did, and she knew it, and I—" The boy stopped. His throat worked. "I was there. The night Holt died. I was there, and I saw it wasn't her." Silas held very still. Outside, from somewhere back toward the courthouse square, he could hear voices rising and the sound of horses moving. Not casual movement, the purposeful movement of men with somewhere specific to be. "Thomas," Silas said, "listen to me. I need you to understand exactly how serious what you just told me is." "I know how serious it is." "Do you?" The boy looked at him steadily. "They almost hung my mother today." "Yeah. I understand how serious it is." Silas looked at him for another moment, then nodded once. He stood up and went to the livery door and looked out. Down the street, he could see 2 of Boone's men mounted and moving slowly, scanning. They hadn't come this direction yet. He went back to Evelyn. She was more alert now, fighting through whatever they'd given her. He could see it in the way she was holding herself, the deliberate effort of it, like a woman swimming through something thick. Her eyes found his, and this time they focused. "You're the man who shot the rope," she said. "Yes." "Why?" It was such a direct question that it stopped him for a moment. Why? Not thank you, not who are you, but why? He liked her for it even though the timing was inconvenient. "Seemed like the right thing," he said. "People in this town have known what was happening for 8 days," she said. Her voice was gathering strength as she talked, like a fire catching from small kindling. "Not one of them—" She stopped, made a deliberate decision not to finish that sentence. "I'm not from this town," Silas said. "I can tell." She looked at him carefully. "What's your name?" "Silas Granger. I have a ranch up near the Laramie foothills, about 30 miles north of here." He paused. "I came to buy a cow." Something shifted in her face. Not quite a smile. Her face wasn't ready for that yet, but the ghost of one, the shape of one. "That's the strangest thing anyone's ever said to me." "It's the truth," he said. He stood up again and looked at the 5 children arranged around their mother. The second boy, younger than Thomas, maybe 11, with a fever-bright look in his eyes that Silas didn't like. The 2 girls, both dark-haired like their mother, one of them asleep on her feet. The small one who had stopped crying and was now watching Silas with the wide, measuring eyes of a very young child, making a very adult decision about whether someone was safe. "I can get you out of this town tonight, all of you. My place isn't much, but it's defensible, and it's away from here. And if Thomas will tell me everything he saw, there's a chance, a real chance, not a guarantee, we can take what he knows to the territorial authorities." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "They'll come after us," she said. "Yes." "In the dark. In the cold." "Yes." "With my children." "Yes." He met her eyes. "I know that's not a good plan. I don't have a better one. Staying here is not an option." She was quiet for a moment longer. He noticed her hands had found her children automatically, one on Thomas's arm, one in the small girl's hair. Without her looking, without her thinking about it. Just reaching and finding them the way you reach for something you've done 1,000 times. "My youngest," she said. "Danny, the second boy. He's been sick 3 days. Fever." Silas looked at the 11-year-old. "I can see that. You'd still take us?" "I'm not leaving a sick child in this town tonight," he said. "Not with those men out there." She held his gaze for a long moment. He had no idea what she was looking for. Whatever it was, she seemed to find enough of it. "All right," she said. She said it the way people say things when they've run out of other choices, which is honest, and he respected that. She wasn't saying she trusted him. She was saying she was choosing this because the alternatives were all worse. He understood that kind of choice. He'd made enough of them. He slipped out of the livery and spoke quietly to the liveryman, whose name was Bud, who claimed to have no opinion about anything that had happened today, and who accepted $4 with the elaborately casual expression of a man pretending he wasn't accepting $4. Silas got Odessa fed and watered, and the children's horse, a sway-backed gray that looked older than wisdom, readied alongside her. He arranged what supplies the livery had and what he carried in his own pack: hardtack, dried venison, 2 blankets, a tin of matches in a waterproof case, and $3.50 he had left after the liveryman. He had not bought his cow. He went back for the Mercers as the sun began its early winter drop toward the ridgeline, and as he moved through the shadows of the livery's back passage, Thomas fell into step beside him, the boy's breath making small clouds in the cold. "Mr. Granger," Thomas said. "Yeah." "The night Mr. Holt died." The boy's voice was very even, controlled in a way that didn't match his age and didn't bode well. "I didn't just see what happened." Silas waited. "He told me things. Mr. Holt, before he died. He knew what was happening to him, and he had papers, documents. He told me where he hid them." Thomas's jaw worked. "In the judge's own courthouse. Hid them inside the courthouse because he knew Boone would never think to look there." Silas stopped walking. He turned and looked at Thomas Mercer, this 14-year-old boy who was holding something large and dangerous and fragile, and who had somehow kept it intact for 8 days while his mother waited to be hanged, and the judge who'd ordered it walked 30 feet away on the other side of a wall. "Thomas," Silas said carefully, "those documents, do you know what they say?" Some of it. The boy met his eyes without flinching. Enough. Silas stood there for a moment in the darkening livery with the smell of hay and horse and cold air coming through the gaps in the boards. And he thought about the cow he hadn't bought, and the quiet ranch he'd been riding back to, and the particular narrow life he'd been building there, which was not a good life exactly, but was a contained one, a manageable one, a life with no more moving pieces than he could keep track of. Then he thought about 200 people who had watched and said nothing. "Tell me everything," he said. And the boy did. They left Black Hollow in the last gray light of the afternoon, moving north along the creek bed, where the frozen ground would hold fewer tracks than the open road. Silas put Thomas on Odessa behind him and let Evelyn take the sway-backed gray with the 3 younger children arranged around her. The older girl, Clara, 12 years old, and already with the set expression of someone who had decided she would not cry in front of strangers, sitting behind her mother with her arms wrapped tight. The younger girl, May, who was 8 and had not said a single word since Silas had first seen her in the mud outside the platform, was in front. And Danny, the sick one, the 11-year-old with the fever eyes, was wedged between his mother's arm and the saddle horn, his head leaning back against Evelyn's chest, his breathing audible even over the sound of the horses moving through the frozen creek bed. The smallest one, the 4-year-old girl whose name was Ruth, was tucked inside Evelyn's coat with only the top of her head showing. It was not a practical arrangement. None of it was practical. The horses were overloaded, the light was going, and the temperature had already dropped enough that Silas could feel it through his canvas coat in a way that meant real cold, not just uncomfortable cold. But they moved, which was the only thing that mattered in that moment, and Black Hollow fell away behind them in the early dark. Thomas did not speak for the first half hour. Silas didn't push him. The boy had said enough in the livery to set the shape of things, and what he'd said was sitting heavy in Silas's chest in the way that serious information always did. Not panic, just weight. The kind that settles in and makes you aware of every decision you're making. What Thomas had told him was this. 8 days ago, before dawn, Thomas had slipped out of the house the way boys do, for reasons that had nothing to do with anything important. He'd wanted to check a trap line he'd set along the eastern fence of Randall Holt's property, a rabbit trap, the kind of small private enterprise that 14-year-old boys engage in and prefer their mothers not know about. He'd been crossing behind Holt's barn when he saw a light in the old man's kitchen window and heard voices. He should have kept walking. He was a smart enough kid to know he should have kept walking, but he heard his mother's name and he stopped. Through the gap in the barn wall, he saw Judge Edgar Boone standing over Randall Holt, who was seated at his kitchen table, and the conversation was not going well for Holt. Silas had asked what he meant by that, and Thomas had gone quiet for a moment, and then said in a voice stripped of almost everything, "Boone had a bottle. He poured something in a cup and he made Mr. Holt drink it. And Mr. Holt was trying to talk, trying to say he'd change his mind. He wouldn't say anything, but Boone just... He watched him. And then he left. And I could see Mr. Holt through the window, and he was already starting to..." Thomas had stopped, swallowed. He died before the sun came up. What Holt had been going to say, what he'd been prepared to reveal before Boone got there first, was something Thomas had learned in pieces. Holt had spoken to Thomas's mother 2 days before his death, had come to her specifically because she was not connected to the town's power structure, because she had no reason to protect Boone or anyone else, and because Randall Holt, who was 63 years old and had spent 40 of those years watching men like Boone operate, had decided it was finally time to stop watching. He told Evelyn that Boone had been systematically falsifying land grants for 3 years, annexing properties whose owners had died or disappeared under circumstances that, reviewed carefully, were not as natural as they first appeared. He'd been building an empire acre by acre, and the documentation of that empire, deeds, transfer records, correspondence, existed, and Holt had copies of it, hidden where Boone would never think to look. Inside the courthouse, in a hollowed-out section of the wall behind the bailiff's storage closet. When Holt died and Boone needed a name to attach to the murder, Evelyn Mercer was the obvious choice. She had visited Holt. She had no powerful friends. She had 5 children and a dead husband and a small property that sat on land Boone had been eyeing for 6 months. It was not complicated. It was just ruthless. Thomas had not told anyone what he'd seen because he was 14 and he was terrified. And for the first 3 days, he'd kept telling himself that surely it wouldn't go this far. Surely someone would step in. Surely his mother would be released. By the time he understood that no one was stepping in, Evelyn had been in custody for 5 days, and Thomas was the only other person alive who knew what had happened in Holt's kitchen. He'd spent 3 days being very careful to look like a scared but ignorant boy, which was not entirely an act, and very careful not to do anything that would make Boone's men look at him too closely. And now he was on a horse in the dark heading north through frozen country, and Silas was beginning to understand the particular weight of what the boy had been carrying by himself. They rode for 2 hours before Silas called a stop. Not because the horses needed it, though they did, but because Danny needed it. The boy's temperature had been climbing since they left Black Hollow. Silas could feel it radiating off him when he took him down from the gray and laid him on the ground. Evelyn was beside him immediately, her hands on the boy's face, and even in the near dark, Silas could see the way her expression changed when she felt the heat coming off her son's skin. She kept her face very controlled. She didn't let any of the other children see what she was thinking. "How long has he been like this?" Silas asked again, lower. "The fever started 4 days ago. Before that he had a cough." She was pulling her coat off and wrapping it around Danny with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had made this decision, her warmth for her child's, without thinking about it. "In the jail they wouldn't bring a doctor. I asked. Every day I asked." Silas took off his own coat and handed it to her without comment. She looked at him. "Take it," he said. "You'll freeze." "I run warm." This was not entirely true, but was true enough. He turned away and started building a fire in the lee of a limestone outcrop, keeping it small. Small enough for warmth, too small to be seen from a distance, he hoped. Thomas came and crouched beside him, without being asked, and started feeding kindling, and they worked together in a comfortable and somewhat surprising silence. "You were a lawman," Thomas said eventually. It wasn't a question. "Marshal, federal. What happened?" Silas kept his eyes on the fire. "That's a longer conversation." Thomas accepted this without pushing. He was the kind of kid who understood when he'd reached a wall, which was a useful quality even if it probably came from hard experience. Clara had gotten the younger girls settled on the ground near the fire, May asleep almost immediately with her head on her older sister's lap. Ruth had emerged from inside Evelyn's coat and was sitting with her thumb in her mouth, watching the fire with the wide, unreadable eyes of very young children who are witnessing things that will settle into them in ways they won't understand for years. Clara was watching Silas build the fire, and her expression was the most complicated thing in camp. Protective, suspicious, exhausted, and underneath all of it, very carefully, something that wanted to trust. Silas understood that look. He'd earned it before and lost it, and it had cost him, and he was not going to make promises to this family about what he was or wasn't. Evelyn sat with Danny and the coat, and one hand moving in small circles on the boy's back, and she didn't look at the fire or at Silas. She looked at her son, and she stayed very still, and the stillness was doing something for her that movement couldn't. "Tell me about the documents," Silas said to Thomas. "I already told you." "Tell me more specifically. I need to know exactly what's in that wall and exactly what it proves. If we're going to take this to territorial authorities, I need to know whether it's enough or whether we're just making noise." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Holt said there were deed transfers, land records with forged signatures. He had letters, actual letters from Boone to a man in Cheyenne, a land broker, telling him which properties to prepare transfer papers for. He looked at the fire. He had a list. Names of people who died or disappeared, with dates, and he had records of money transfers, where it all went. "That's enough," Silas said. Thomas looked at him sharply. "To convict him?" "To make a strong case. With your testimony. With your mother's. They'll say I'm a kid. They'll say I'm a kid who's lying to protect his mother." "Yes," Silas said. "They'll say that. That's why the documents matter. That's why you staying alive and healthy enough to testify matters." He fed another piece of wood to the fire. "And that's why we have to get you to Laramie before Boone's men get to us." Thomas absorbed this. His face did something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite resolution. Something in between. "How far is your ranch?" "On a good day, with good horses, maybe 10 hours north. We've got bad horses and at least one sick person. And the weather—" Silas glanced at the sky, which had the particular heavy, low quality of sky that meant snow. Not yet, but soon. It's going to snow. It's Wyoming in November, Thomas said. It always snows. I know. Can we make it? Silas looked at him. He thought about the honest answer, which was that he didn't know, and the useful answer, which was something he could make a case for. If we start before light tomorrow and Danny can ride, yes. If the snow comes heavy tonight and Danny can't ride, he stopped. We adjust. Thomas stared at him. That's not a plan. No, it's an honest assessment of our situation, which is not the same thing. He met the boy's eyes. I'm not going to tell you it's fine when it might not be. That help you or hurt you? Thomas thought about it. Helps me, he admitted. Okay then. The snow came around midnight. It did not come the way light snow comes, apologetically, in small drifts. It came the way Wyoming snow comes in November when it has decided to be serious, which is all at once and from every direction simultaneously, the wind picking up and flattening everything into a white blur that made the fire curl and spit. Silas had banked the fire against the limestone and rigged his saddle blanket as a windbreak, which helped some. Not as much as he needed. Danny's fever broke and then came back, which was the wrong order for that to happen. The boy was awake for a little while around 2 in the morning, and Silas gave him water from the canteen, holding him up to drink it, and Danny's eyes were too bright and too aware in a way that wasn't good. He looked at Silas with the direct assessment of a sick child who has been sick before and knows when adults are managing how worried they are. Am I going to die? Danny asked. No, Silas said. That was fast, Danny said. You didn't even think about it. I thought about it fast, Silas said. Danny almost smiled. It turned into a cough instead, which lasted long enough to bring Evelyn over with her hand on the boy's chest, and then passed. He lay back down and was asleep again in less than a minute. Evelyn stayed where she was, crouched over him in the snow, her hair plastered to her face. Silas handed her the canteen without saying anything, and she drank from it and handed it back, and neither of them said what they were both aware of, which was that the nearest doctor was in the direction they had come from. He got sick 2 days before they arrested me, she said quietly. Her voice was flat in the way that voices go when the speaker is being very careful. I was taking care of him and I couldn't. They came in the morning while I was trying to get his fever down. They just took me out of the house in front of all of them. She stopped. Clara had to take care of him. She's 12. Silas said nothing. She did fine, Evelyn said. And then, in a completely different voice, softer and rawer, she shouldn't have had to. No, Silas said. She shouldn't have. Evelyn looked at him. It was the middle of the night and snowing and she hadn't slept in. He didn't want to guess how long, and the bruise on her cheekbone had gone the color of a bad storm, and she looked at him with an expression that was not gratitude exactly. It was something more complicated than gratitude. The look of someone who is taking the full measure of a thing and not letting politeness soften what they find. Why did you really stop? She asked. In Black Hollow. A man coming to buy a cow doesn't just... She gestured at the fire, the snow, the 6 of them in the dark. This. Silas looked at the fire for a moment. I saw the children kneeling in the mud, he said. That was... He stopped, started again. There was someone. A while back, I didn't... He stopped again, and the sentence went nowhere, and he let it. I just couldn't ride past it, he said finally. It was inadequate, but it was true. Evelyn held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once, as if he'd said considerably more than he had. She went back to Danny. Silas sat up through the rest of the night. The morning was brutal. The snow had laid down 8 inches and was still falling, slower now but steady, and the horses were miserable and the children were cold in the deep, gray-faced way of children who have been pushed past what children should be pushed to. May hadn't spoken, and still hadn't spoken, which was its own quiet alarm. Ruth was crying again, the exhausted cycling cry of a child who cannot explain what she needs, and Clara was holding her and rocking her and saying nothing, just rocking. Thomas came to Silas before the others were fully up. There's a rider, he said quietly, back on the ridge. I saw him when the snow eased. Silas went still. One? I only saw one. He was there for a while and then he wasn't. How long ago? Maybe 15 minutes. Silas went to Odessa and checked his rifle. One rider on a ridge at dawn wasn't necessarily Boone's men. It wasn't impossible that it was just a rancher or a trapper moving through. He knew that. He also knew it was more likely that Boone had sent people last night while they were still making their fire, and that this rider had found them and ridden back to report, and that more riders would be coming. He made a decision. "We're not going straight to my ranch," he said. Thomas looked at him sharply. "We go straight north. They'll cut us off on the open plain. They know this country better than we do. There's a canyon system about 7 miles northwest of here, Broken Creek. Cuts through the ridge and comes out on the far side of the high ground. It's harder going, but they can't bring a group through fast. We'll move single file." 7 miles in this snow with Danny sick. "I know," Silas said. "Which way would you rather be wrong?" Thomas closed his mouth. They left camp within 20 minutes. Silas had Danny in front of him on Odessa now, the boy's back against his chest. Silas's coat draped around both of them, and even that arrangement, the transfer of his own body heat to the child, was a gamble against the cold. He felt Danny's breathing against his forearm. It was not steady, but it was there. Clara, on the gray with Ruth and May, had said nothing when she saw the arrangement. She'd just looked at Silas with that complicated face and tightened her arms around her sisters. They moved northwest. The canyon took 3 hours to reach instead of 2. The snow made distance strange, and Odessa kept breaking through ice crust at the creek edges, and twice they had to stop while Thomas went ahead on foot to test whether the ground ahead would hold the horse's weight. The second time he broke through to knee depth in freezing water and came back with his jaw set and his teeth not quite chattering, refusing to acknowledge what had just happened to his legs. Silas told him to switch his wet trousers with the dry blanket from the pack and ride on Odessa's back end. Thomas started to argue. Silas looked at him once and Thomas stopped arguing. About 2 miles from the canyon entrance, Evelyn's gray went lame. Not dramatically. The mare didn't fall or cry out. She just stopped moving right, favoring her left foreleg with a hitch that got worse with every step. Evelyn pulled her up and got down in the snow and looked at the hoof, and when she stood up, her expression was the steady, unrevealing expression of someone who is receiving bad news. They were already half expecting. "Stone bruise," she said, "or a crack. She can't carry 3. Silas looked at the gray, at the 3 children, at the distance ahead, at the sky. "Can she carry one?" he asked. Evelyn assessed the mare again. Slowly. "Ruth rides," he said. "May and Clara walk with me. Thomas, back on Odessa." He saw Clara's face and added, before she could say it, "I know you're tired. This is temporary, just the canyon section." "I wasn't going to say anything," Clara said. "I know you weren't." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was almost amused despite everything. "You don't have to manage me," she said. "I'm not little." "No," he said. "You're not." They went into the canyon on foot and horseback, strung out in a line with Silas at the front and Evelyn at the rear, and the canyon walls rose up on either side and blocked the wind, which was the only mercy of the day. The snow on the canyon floor was softer and deeper, which was worse for walking, but better for the horses. Halfway through the canyon, Thomas said from behind Silas's shoulder, "If they follow us in here, there's only one way out." "I know," Silas said. "That doesn't worry you?" "It worries me plenty." He kept walking. "But anyone following us in here is in the same position we are. One way in, one way out." Thomas was quiet for a moment, working through the geometry of that. "You'd wait for them, if they came in after us." "I'd have to." "With 5 children in a box canyon." "With 5 children in a box canyon," Silas confirmed, "which is why I'd rather they didn't follow us in." They reached the far end of the canyon late afternoon, the light already going pale and thin, and came out onto the higher ground on the north side of the ridge. From up here, for the first time since morning, Silas could see behind them, back down through the canyon cut, back toward the open country they'd come through. He saw 2 riders on the plain below, maybe 3 miles back, moving in the right direction. He kept walking. He didn't tell Evelyn yet. She was focused on Danny, who had slid in and out of consciousness for most of the canyon transit, and was now awake in a quiet, low-energy way that was better than unconscious but was not good. The boy had stopped shivering, which sounded like an improvement but was not necessarily one. "Danny," Silas said without stopping, "talk to me." "About what?" Danny said. His voice was thin. "Anything. Don't matter." A pause. "I've been thinking about the cow," Danny said. Silas almost missed a step. "What?" Thomas said you came to Black Hollow to buy a cow. The boy's voice had the distant, slow quality of someone working very hard to keep a thought organized. I keep thinking about that. That you came to buy a cow and now... He gestured vaguely at the canyon, the snow, all of it. Didn't get your cow. No, Silas said. I didn't. That's really bad luck, Danny said, with the complete sincerity of an 11-year-old stating a fact. Behind him, Silas heard Clara make a sound that was the beginning of a laugh stopped very quickly. He did not let his own face do anything, which took some effort. It is, Silas agreed. That is some real bad luck. He pushed them on. The ranch was still 15 miles north and night was coming fast, and behind them 2 riders were moving through frozen country toward a canyon entrance, and Danny's fever was climbing again. Silas could feel it against his arm without having to check, the way you can feel heat from something you're holding close. And May still hadn't spoken, and Clara's boots had a hole in the left sole that she had said nothing about, but that Silas had noticed 3 hours ago, and Evelyn's cracked lips were bleeding again from the cold. None of these were small problems. Piled together, they were the kind of thing that broke journeys, that broke people. But they were moving. Moving north, moving away from Black Hollow, and its silence, and its gallows, and the man who'd built both. Moving towards something Silas couldn't fully promise, but was willing to put himself between this family and everything that stood in the way of. It was not a plan exactly, but it was a direction. And right now, in the dark and the snow and the cold, with 2 riders coming behind them and a sick child on his horse and a widow who'd been 12 minutes from death that morning, a direction was what they had, and a direction was what they were keeping. Thomas pulled his borrowed blanket tighter against the wind and said nothing more. And Odessa, who had outlasted 3 of Silas's better plans, kept walking north. They reached the ranch just before midnight. Silas had not been back in 11 days, which was longer than he'd planned when he rode out to buy a cow, and the place showed it in the way that properties show the absence of their owners. A water trough frozen solid, a shutter on the east window banging loose against the frame in the wind, the woodpile lower than he'd left it because he'd miscalculated and taken 2 days' worth of logs inside before he left, and the cold had eaten through them faster than it should have. None of it was catastrophic. All of it needed doing. He got Danny down from Odessa first and carried him inside. The boy was conscious but barely, his head lolling against Silas's shoulder with the particular boneless quality of a child whose body has decided it's done cooperating for the night. The cabin was cold. Not as cold as outside, but close. And Silas set Danny on the cot near the fireplace and had a fire going in under 4 minutes, which was not a record, but was faster than usual given that his hands had gone clumsy from the cold. Evelyn came in behind him with Ruth on her hip and Clara and May at her heels, and she stood in the middle of the single room and took it in with the quick, assessing eyes of a woman who has walked into many unfamiliar spaces and learned to read them fast. It was a small room, a fireplace, a cot, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf with provisions, a second shelf with tools and ammunition, a window on each wall, and a trapdoor in the floor near the southeast corner that she noted and said nothing about yet. Thomas came in last after seeing to the horses, pulling the door shut behind him and dropping the bar across it without being told. "There's a second cot in the lean-to," Silas said, not looking up from the fire. "It's not heated. I'll move it in here." "I'll get it," Thomas said. Silas started to say he'd do it and stopped himself. The boy needed something to do. He understood that. He turned his attention to Danny. The fever was the worst it had been. He got the boy out of his wet outer layers, which took some doing because Danny had gone past the point of being able to help with the process, and wrapped him in the 2 dry blankets from the pack and the heavier quilt from the chest at the foot of the cot. He pressed the back of his hand to the boy's forehead and kept it there for a moment, and then he stood up and went to the shelf and took down a tin that had been there since last winter. Willow bark, dried, the kind his neighbor Ino had pressed on him with the solemn insistence of a man who believed in it deeply and wanted everyone to share that belief. Silas had accepted it politely and put it on the shelf and more or less forgotten about it. He put water on to boil. Evelyn appeared at his elbow. "Willow bark?" "It's what I've got." She looked at the tin, then at Danny, then back. She didn't say what he knew she was thinking, which was that they needed a doctor, that willow bark was not a doctor, that 11-year-old boys with fevers this high needed more than a frontier remedy and a warm room. She didn't say any of it because saying it didn't change it, and he already knew it, And she was a practical woman in the most fundamental sense. Practical not because she was unafraid, but because she'd learned that panic used up energy she needed for something else. "He's strong," she said instead. "I know," Silas said. "He's been sick before and he's always—" She stopped. Her hands were gripping the edge of the shelf and she made herself let go of it. "He'll be fine," she said, and he understood that she was saying it for herself as much as anything, rehearsing it, making it true by repetition. Clara had gotten May and Ruth onto the moved cot near the fire and was pulling the quilt up around them with the competent, patient movements of someone who has done this 100 times, adjusting the edges, tucking corners. She was 12 years old, and she was mothering her sisters with the ease of long practice, and the observation sat in Silas's chest like something too heavy to put a name to. Thomas came back in with the second cot, and between him and Silas they got it set up near the fire without waking the girls. Evelyn sat on the edge of it and held Danny's hand and did not sleep. Silas told her to sleep, and she thanked him politely and did not sleep. He eventually stopped telling her and moved his chair to the window and sat there with his rifle across his knees and watched the dark outside. The two riders had not followed them into the canyon. He'd watched for another hour after they'd come out the far side and hadn't seen them. Either they'd turned back when they hit the canyon entrance, or they'd split and gone around, which was a longer ride and would have put them somewhere north of here by now, in which case they were either sheltering from the weather somewhere and would come at daylight, or they were not coming to the ranch at all and had been going somewhere else entirely. He didn't put much faith in that last possibility. He sat at the window until 4 in the morning, and then Thomas, who was supposed to be sleeping, came and sat in the other chair without a word, and Silas let him take the watch and closed his eyes for 2 hours. When he woke, Danny's fever had broken. He knew it before he opened his eyes. The room had a different quality, a released quality, like the difference in air pressure before and after a storm passes. Evelyn was still on the cot beside her son, but she was asleep now, finally, tipped sideways with her cheek on the edge of the quilt, and Danny was sleeping with the deep, slack-faced sleep of a fever breaking, his color not good but better, his breathing slow and regular. Thomas was at the window. He looked at Silas. "Rider on the south ridge," he said quietly. "Been there about 20 minutes, not moving." Silas was up and across the room in 2 steps. Through the window, in the gray early light, the ridge to the south was a dark line against a white sky. On it, just at the crest, a single mounted figure sat without moving, looking down at the ranch. As Silas watched, a second figure appeared beside the first, then a third. "How many did Boone send after us, do you think?" Thomas asked. "More than 3, Silas said. "How do you know?" "Because Boone's not a man who sends just enough. He sends more than enough so there's no ambiguity about the outcome." He stepped back from the window. "Wake your mother. Don't wake the girls yet." Thomas moved. Silas went to the shelf and took down the box of ammunition and started loading the spare rifle. An older Winchester he kept cleaned but rarely needed, the kind of backup that ranchers kept and hoped they'd never touch. He loaded it without hurrying. Hurrying with ammunition was how you made mistakes. Evelyn appeared at his shoulder. She took in the second rifle, looked at the window, looked at his face, and reached a conclusion. "How many?" she said. "At least 3 on the south ridge. Probably more I can't see yet." She was quiet for a moment. "What are our options?" He looked at her. Most people in her situation would have asked him what he was going to do, which put the problem entirely on one side. She'd asked about options, which was a different kind of question. "We can wait for them to move first," he said. "See what they want, how they want to play it. Maybe they're just watching. Maybe Boone sent them to intimidate, not to—" He stopped, because they both knew the rest of that sentence wasn't worth saying. "Or," she said. "The trapdoor in the floor," he said, "goes to a root cellar. There's a passage at the far end that comes up in the old barn, about 30 yards east. I built it 2 years ago for a reason I don't need to explain." He held her gaze. "You take the children through, all 5, stay in the barn. There's a hay door on the north side. If it goes badly here, you open it and you run north and you don't stop." She looked at him for a moment. "And you stay here?" "Yes." "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." Her jaw was tight. She looked at the window, at the rifles, back at him. And then she did something he did not expect, which was to reach out and take the spare Winchester from the shelf beside him. "Show me how this one loads," she said. He stared at her. I know how to shoot, she said, with a mild impatience that under different circumstances might have been funny. My husband taught me before he died. I just haven't used this particular model. Evelyn, don't, she said. It was one word, and it was final. Don't tell me to go in the cellar. My children are in this room. This is my fight more than yours. She met his eyes with a directness that was not aggressive. It was just true, the kind of true that doesn't need to argue about itself. Show me the rifle. He showed her the rifle. They woke Clara and told her what was happening without softening it. The girl went very pale, and then very still. And then she nodded once, and her expression settled into something that had no right to be on a 12-year-old's face, but was there nonetheless. She got May and Ruth up quietly, and when Ruth started to ask questions, Clara whispered something in her ear that made the small girl press her lips together and nod. And Silas didn't ask what she'd said because whatever it was had worked. Thomas took up a position at the east window. At the south window, the main window, the one facing the ridge. The three figures on the ridge had not moved. The sky was lightening. In the new gray light, he could count more carefully. There were 5 riders visible now, spread along the ridge at intervals, and he had a strong feeling there were more below the crest on the far side, held back. He opened the window an inch. You on the ridge, he called out, his voice carried well in the cold. You're on private land. State your business. A pause. Then one of the riders moved forward a few paces and called back, We're here for the woman and the boy. Send them out and there's no trouble for you. That's not going to happen, Silas said. Another pause. When the rider spoke again, his voice was the same. Not angry, not threatening, just matter of fact. The voice of a man reading from a script he'd been handed. Judge Boone has lawful authority to... Judge Boone can come tell me that himself, Silas said. I'll be here. There was a longer silence this time. Then the riders on the ridge pulled back out of sight. They're regrouping, Thomas said from the east window. I know. What do we do while they're regrouping? We get ready. What followed was not the kind of thing that makes sense when you describe it from outside. From outside, it would look like a small group of exhausted, underprepared people arranging themselves in a single-room cabin against overwhelming odds, which was exactly what it was and exactly what it looked like. Silas moved the furniture, table against the front door, cot braced against the south wall below the window. He gave Thomas the position by the east window with the instruction to fire only if someone was coming through it, not before. And Thomas accepted this with the gravity of a boy who understands that he's been given a real responsibility and not a pretend one. Evelyn was at the south window with the spare rifle, and Silas stood back from it where he could see both windows at once. Clara was in the corner with May and Ruth on either side of her, the 3 of them against the safest wall, the north wall, the one with no window. And she had Ruth's face pressed against her shoulder and her arm around May, and she was looking at Silas with an expression he could not read and did not try to. Danny slept through all of it. They hit the cabin at first light, not from the ridge. That was the thing. Silas had been watching the ridge, and they came from the east instead, 4 men on foot moving fast through the snow toward the east wall, and Thomas saw them and called out, and Silas was across the room before the first one reached the window. The next 8 minutes were the worst 8 minutes Silas had experienced since a night in a different territory 6 years ago that he did not allow himself to think about in detail. Glass broke. The door took an impact that moved the table 6 inches. A bullet came through the south wall at an angle that suggested someone had found the angle. They had someone who knew what they were doing, not just a collection of rough riders. Silas took a graze across his left forearm that he didn't notice until afterward, which was how things like that usually went. What he did notice, in a moment that stopped time in the particular way that certain moments do, was Evelyn. She was at the south window. She had not fired yet, had been holding, as he told her to, not wasting ammunition. And then through the south window came a figure pulling himself over the sill, and Evelyn stepped forward and put the rifle against the man's chest before he'd cleared the frame, and said something to him that Silas could not hear over the noise, and the man went very still, and Silas crossed the room in 4 strides and got him the rest of the way through the window and onto the floor and zip-tied his wrists with the leather cord from his boot, and it was only after that he registered that his hands were shaking slightly, and Evelyn's were not. You told me you could shoot, he said. He was breathing hard. I said I know how to shoot, she said. Doesn't mean I wanted to. What did you say to him? She glanced at the man on the floor, who was staring up at the ceiling with the expression of someone reconsidering his life choices. I told him if he moved, I'd fire, and if he didn't, I wouldn't. She paused. I wasn't sure which I preferred. The fire outside went suddenly, completely silent. Silas went to the window. The figures he could see were pulling back. He counted the retreat and came up with 4, plus the one on the floor, which was not consistent with the numbers he'd estimated earlier, which meant there were still men unaccounted for. Thomas, he said quietly. I see it, Thomas said from the east window. They're not all pulling back. 2 of them went around the north side. North side. The barn. The trap door. Silas looked at Clara. She'd seen it in his face before he said it. She was already pulling May closer with one arm, her other hand over Ruth's ears. We're fine, she said preemptively, in the tone of someone who has decided the statement is true and is making it so through sheer will. I have to go to the barn, Silas said. I know, Clara said. He went to the trapdoor, lifted it, and looked at the tunnel below. In the dark, it was just a hole with a rope ladder and the smell of earth and cold. He had built it alone on a rainy October afternoon 2 years ago, for reasons he'd told himself had to do with food storage, and it actually had to do with the specific way his mind worked after 11 years of living in situations where exits mattered. He went down. The tunnel was low enough that he had to crouch, and it smelled like roots and frost, and it was dark enough that he moved by feel along the left wall, the way he'd drilled himself to do the one time he'd run it at night. It took longer than he'd wanted. He came up through the barn floor in the corner behind the haystacks, came up quiet, and lay still for a moment listening. 2 voices. Low, moving along the north wall of the barn. He could not see them. He could hear them, and from the sound he could estimate, both near the hay door, which meant they had the same idea he'd been afraid of, finding the exit point and waiting at it, or coming through it toward the cabin. He moved around the haystack on his hands and knees and came up on their left flank. Stop, he said. Both men turned. What happened next was not elegant. It was not the clean resolution of a man in control of every variable. One of the men swung first, and Silas took the impact on his shoulder and put the man down with 2 hits that left him functional but uninterested in continuing. The second man had a gun out, and Silas had his forearm up, and the gun went off, and the hay beside his head jumped. And then Silas had the man's wrist, and the gun was pointing at the barn ceiling and stayed there until the man let it go, which he did after a conversation conducted entirely through leverage and pain rather than words. He stood there afterward with both men down and the ringing in his ears from the gunshot inside the barn, and his shoulder already telling him it was going to be extremely unpleasant by tomorrow, and he breathed for a moment in the hay-smelling dark. Then he went back through the tunnel. He came up through the trapdoor to find Evelyn standing over the man on the floor with the rifle in her hands, and Clara still in the corner with the girls, and Thomas at the window saying, quietly and repeatedly, "They're all pulling back, all of them. They're going." Silas stood up out of the trapdoor and put his back against the wall and let himself breathe for a full 30 seconds. "You're bleeding," Evelyn said. She was looking at his left arm. "It's old," he said. Then he looked, and it wasn't particularly old, but it had stopped. She was across the room before he'd decided whether to say anything else, and she was pulling his sleeve back with the careful, impersonal efficiency of a woman who had cleaned up wounds before and had no time for squeamishness about it. Her hands were steady. He found that remarkable and said so, and she gave him a look that was half exasperated and half something else. "I was scared the whole time," she said flatly. "My hands don't know that." He processed this. "That's useful," he said. "It is," she agreed and went to get the cloth from the water basin. The man on the floor, Silas had established his name through a short and pointed conversation, was Clem Hodder, a writer who'd worked for Boone for 3 years, had turned out to be more forthcoming than expected once it was clear his employer's backup plan had not materialized. He was not a complicated man. He was the kind of man who signed on for the pay and wasn't paid enough to die for it, and Boone's plan, he explained with the tired resignation of someone whose loyalty had a very clear ceiling, had been to take Evelyn back to Black Hollow and to bring Thomas specifically, just Thomas, not the other children. Silas looked at Evelyn when Hodder said that. She looked back at him. Neither of them said what that implied, because Thomas was in the room. Thomas, who was no fool, said it himself. "He knows what I saw," he said. His voice was even, too even. He doesn't know about the documents. He just knows I was there. He wants me to disappear. Evelyn made a sound. Mom, Thomas said quickly. I know. It's fine. It is not fine, she said, with a precision that brooked no argument. I meant, I know what it means. I'm not surprised. He looked at Silas. What do we do with him? He nodded at Hodder. Silas looked at the man on the floor. He thought about it practically. He couldn't take Hodder with them. The journey ahead was already beyond what they had resources for. He couldn't let him go free to ride back to Boone and describe the ranch in detail and their numbers and the condition of the children. He could tie him to something substantial and hope he'd be found before he froze, which was the option that left him the most alive and Silas the most comfortable about his own choices. There was a tree 40 yards east of the ranch, with a branch low enough to reach and a trunk solid enough to hold a man upright if you used enough cord. He walked Hodder out there in the cold and secured him thoroughly enough that he'd be uncomfortable but not in danger, and he put Hodder's own coat over his shoulders because the temperature had dropped, and Silas had not actually decided he wanted the man to die out here, just to stay put for 24 hours, which should be sufficient. He left water within reach. He went back to the cabin. Danny was awake. Not fully, not strongly, but awake in the actual sense, sitting up against the wall with his quilt wrapped around him and his eyes tracking the room with real focus for the first time since Black Hollow. He looked pale and wrung out, and like something that had been through the laundry too many times, but his eyes were clear. What happened to the window? He asked. This was the east window, which had taken a crack in the lower pane during the attack. Wind, said May. It was the first word she had spoken in 2 days. Everyone in the room heard it. Silas turned very carefully and found May sitting up on the cot looking at her brother with the most animation she'd shown since the courthouse square, and next to her Clara had gone very still and was looking at May with an expression that was trying very hard not to become crying. Wind, Danny repeated, looking at the cracked pane. Huh, some wind. It was really something, Thomas said, and his voice cracked on the last word in the way voices do when they're carrying more than they're meant to. Evelyn was standing in the middle of the room with her hand over her mouth and her eyes very bright, and she was not looking at anyone because she was doing the thing she'd been doing since Black Hollow, which was keeping herself together in front of her children by main force of will. And right now the will was working, but only barely. Silas went to the fireplace and added a log and watched the fire for a moment. He heard, behind him, the specific sound of a mother sitting down next to her child and pulling him into her arms, and the specific sound of a boy who is 11 and feverish and been through something bad who does not resist that, and he kept his eyes on the fire. Mr. Granger, Ruth said. She was standing at his elbow. He looked down. She was looking up at him with those wide, serious eyes that had not quite blinked in the normal way since he'd first seen her. Yeah, he said. She held up her arms the way very young children do, the universal request that requires no words. He picked her up. She was heavier than she looked. She put her head on his shoulder and he stood there holding a 4-year-old girl in front of his fireplace while his shoulder ached and his forearm stung, and outside in the cold Wyoming morning. Clem Hodder was tied to a tree, feeling sorry about his life decisions. He stood there for a while. After a time, Evelyn came and stood beside him, not touching, just beside him. She looked at the fire. We still have to get to Laramie, she said. Low, not for the children. I know. The documents in Black Hollow. We can't get to Laramie without those documents. I know that too. She turned and looked at him directly. This close, he could see the bruise on her cheekbone had gone through yellow at the edges, which meant it was older than the arrest. She'd been hit before the courthouse, which he filed away for later use. You can't go back to Black Hollow, she said. Boone knows your face. He knows this ranch. If you go back... I know all of that, Silas said. Then what's the plan? He thought about it. He thought about the hollowed wall behind the bailiff's closet in Boone's own courthouse, and about 3 land riders and a boy 14 years old and a woman who shot straight and didn't shake, and about the way this had all begun with a rifle shot and a snapped rope and a man who'd come to buy a cow. He did not have a clean answer. He had the outline of something that required more luck than he liked, and more trust in other people than he usually allowed himself, and several moving pieces that could go wrong individually and certainly would go wrong together in at least 2 ways he hadn't thought of yet. But in his arms, Ruth had fallen asleep with her face against his neck. And behind him, Danny was saying something low and faintly indignant to Thomas. And Thomas was saying something back that made Clara inhale a laugh she was trying not to have, and Evelyn was watching him wait for his answer. "I'm working on it," he said. She held his gaze for another moment, and then she nodded and turned back to her children, and the fire burned on. The plan Silas had been working on came together slowly, the way bad plans do. Not because the pieces were elegant, but because there weren't enough good options to be selective about. He laid it out the next morning at the table, with Evelyn across from him and Thomas standing because he was the kind of boy who thought better on his feet, and the fire going behind them, and the children still asleep. Outside, the snow had stopped and the cold had hardened into the dry, breathless kind that meant clear skies and visibility, which was both useful and dangerous. "I have to go back to Black Hollow," Silas said. Thomas opened his mouth. "Not into town," Silas said. "I'm not walking into Boone's courthouse. But there's a man in Black Hollow who I think will go in for us." He looked at Evelyn. "The livery man, Bud." She considered this. "He took your money." "He did. And he didn't tell Boone's men where we'd gone, because if he had, they'd have been on us before we reached the creek bed." Silas turned his coffee cup in his hands. It was his last coffee. He'd been rationing it, and this was the last of it. "He's not a brave man, but he's not their man either. You're going to ask a timid livery owner to walk into a judge's courthouse and steal evidence," Thomas said. "I'm going to ask him to retrieve something from a wall he has legitimate reason to be near," Silas said. "The bailiff's storage closet is 12 feet from the livery entrance on the courthouse's south side. Bud goes in and out of that building twice a week to collect feed payment from the court's stable contract. He's been doing it for years. Nobody looks at him." Thomas was quiet, working through it. "And if he says no," Evelyn asked, "then I go in myself at night, and I either get the documents or I get caught. And if I get caught, none of this works." He said it plainly, not dramatically, because it was just the honest shape of the situation. "Bud is better." Evelyn looked at the table for a moment. "How long will you be gone?" 2 days there, 2 back if the weather holds. 4 days total." He looked at her. "Danny's not ready to travel. Clara's boot needs replacing before she walks another mile in the snow. 4 days gives everyone some strength back. And if Boone sends more men while you're gone—" It wasn't quite a question. He answered it like one. "The 2 from the barn are tied up in the old spring house. I checked them this morning. They're unhappy, but fine. Hodder's still on his tree. Boone won't know what happened here for at least another day, maybe 2, depending on when he expects his riders back." He paused. "I'll leave you the spare rifle, and I'll show Thomas every position in this cabin worth knowing." Thomas looked at him with an expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite resentment. The look of a boy who understands he's being trusted with something real and isn't sure he wants it. "You'll be all right," Silas said, and he meant it not as reassurance but as assessment. He'd watched Thomas for 3 days now. The boy was steady in the way that mattered. Not fearless, not reckless, just steady. Evelyn was quiet for a long time. The fire popped. Somewhere in the other room, Ruth made a small sound in her sleep that resolved into nothing. "Come back," Evelyn said finally. It was not a request exactly. It had the quality of a statement of expectation, something between a condition and a demand, and he held it carefully. "That's the plan," he said. He left before noon. Odessa was rested enough, and the clear cold made the ground firm under her hooves, which was better than snow for speed. Silas rode south with his rifle across his saddle and the particular focused emptiness in his head that he'd learned in his marshalling years. Not thinking about what could go wrong, not thinking about what he'd left behind. Just riding, just watching the country, just being present enough to respond to whatever presented itself. He was 4 miles out when he let himself think about Evelyn. He didn't want to. He'd been not thinking about her deliberately since the night before, because thinking about her was the kind of thing that introduced variables he couldn't control, and variables he couldn't control made him worse at what he was doing, not better. But 4 miles out, with the ranch behind him and Black Hollow ahead, and nothing to look at but white country and gray sky, the deliberate not thinking became harder than just letting it happen. She had said come back like it mattered whether he did, like the calculation of whether to trust him had been made and completed, and the result was that his returning or not returning was something she had a stake in. He was aware that this might simply be practical, He was their best resource for surviving the next week, and of course she wanted him back. He was also aware, in the less practical part of himself, that it was possible she meant something else. He did not examine that possibility closely. He had a history of being wrong about that kind of thing, and the margin for that particular error was one he could not afford right now. He thought about her hands not shaking while his did. He thought about the way she'd taken the spare rifle and said, "Show me how this one loads," with the patient tone of someone who had already decided the outcome and just needed the information. He thought about Ruth's head on his shoulder. He stopped thinking about Evelyn. He reached the outskirts of Black Hollow at dusk on the second day and made camp in a dry wash 2 miles east of town, which was far enough to be invisible and close enough that he didn't waste morning light. He ate cold-dried venison because a fire was inadvisable, and lay on his back looking at a sky so packed with stars it was almost white. And he slept better than he'd expected and worse than he needed. In the morning he rode into town from the north, which was not the direction anyone would expect, and he kept his hat brim low and traded his canvas coat for the darker wool blanket from his pack, which changed his silhouette enough to matter for the first 30 seconds of any encounter. He'd learned a long time ago that the first 30 seconds were what people remembered. He found Bud at the livery before 6 in the morning. The old man was forking hay, and he looked up when Silas came in, and his face did several things quickly: recognition, alarm, calculation, resignation. And then he went back to forking hay. "Figured you'd either be dead or back," he said. "Still working on both," Silas said. He came in and stood beside a stall and kept his voice low. "How's the town?" "Nervous." Bud set the fork against the wall. "Boone's been in a mood. Sent 6 men north and hasn't heard back from them, which..." The old man glanced at Silas. "Which I take to mean they didn't find what they were looking for." "They found something," Silas said, "just not what they wanted." Bud absorbed this without asking for details. "What do you need?" Silas told him. The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man doing math, the kind of math that's mostly about how much he values his own skin versus how much a thing matters to him. Bud was 60-something years old and had been in Black Hollow for 12 years and had watched Edgar Boone build his courthouse and his empire and his system and had said nothing, and Silas understood the weight of that silence and did not rush it. "The wall behind the bailiff's closet," Bud said finally. "You're sure?" "The boy is sure. He got it from Holt directly." "Holt?" Bud's jaw worked. Randall Holt was a decent man. He had good horses. He said this last part not as a non sequitur, but as the particular endorsement of a liveryman, which was its own kind of eulogy. "What's in the wall?" "Enough to take Boone down in front of a territorial court, deed transfers, forged documents, correspondence." Silas held the old man's gaze. "Names of people who died so Boone could take their land." Bud was quiet. "How many names?" he said. "I don't know exactly." "Enough." Another long silence. Outside, the town was beginning its morning sounds. A door, a horse, someone crossing the frozen street. Every sound made Bud's shoulders tighten slightly. "I do the feed collection on Thursdays," Bud said. "Today's Wednesday," Silas said. "I know what day it is." The old man picked up the fork again and set it down again. "I can go today if I go before Prentice," that's the bailiff, "before Prentice comes in. Before 7. He's never in before 7. He looked at Silas with the expression of a man who is angry at himself for agreeing to something and is doing it anyway. "You'll stay out of sight. I'll be in the dry wash east of the mill. And if someone sees me, if someone asks what I was doing..." "You were looking for a misplaced invoice. You've done business there for years. You belong there." Bud stared at him. "That's not a very good cover story." "It doesn't have to be very good. It just has to be good enough for the 30 seconds before people stop paying attention." Bud muttered something Silas didn't catch, which was probably better that way, and pulled his coat off the hook. He was back in the dry wash in 45 minutes. He came in fast, which was not his normal pace, and his face was the color of old chalk, and he was carrying a canvas satchel that he held out to Silas at arm's length, like a man who wants to pass something off and be done with it. "It was there," Bud said. He was breathing hard. "Exactly where you said. Hollow behind a false panel, board comes out if you know to look for it." He paused. "I knew to look for it because I'd seen Holt near that wall twice and didn't think anything of it until now." He looked at Silas. "How does a man see something twice and not think anything of it?" Because Holt needed you not to, Silas said gently. He took the satchel. Inside were 3 bundles of folded papers, tied with kitchen string, the edges gone soft with age and handling. He didn't open them yet. He put them inside his coat against his chest, where his body heat would keep them from the cold. Bud was watching him. Is she alive? Mercer woman? Yes. And her children? All 5. The old man nodded once. He picked up the canvas satchel and folded it under his arm and looked at Silas with the expression of a man who has done something he's surprised at himself for doing. You gonna be able to do anything with that? He nodded at Silas's coat, where the papers were. Actually hold Boone accountable. Not just make noise. I have a witness who saw Boone poison Holt, Silas said. I have the widow who Holt told before he died. I have physical evidence of at least 3 years of fraud. He met Bud's eyes. And I have a territorial judge in Laramie who is not Edgar Boone and who I have reason to believe takes land fraud seriously. Bud was quiet for a moment. You know the judge in Laramie? We've met. It was not the whole story, which was that the territorial judge in Laramie was a man named Harlan Price, who had served alongside Silas in his marshalling years, and who owed him a debt of the specific kind that didn't have a money equivalent. But Silas was not going to explain all of that to Bud in a dry wash at 6:30 in the morning. Bud nodded slowly. All right, he said, in the tone of a man closing a door on a room he's been staring into for too long. All right. He turned to go. Bud, Silas said. The old man stopped. When this is over, and it will be over, one way or another, probably inside of 3 weeks, you're going to need to decide whether you want to be someone who testifies to what you know about this town or someone who stayed out of it. He said it plainly, without accusation. Either one is a choice you can make. I'm just telling you it's coming. Bud stood with his back to Silas for a moment. Then he walked away without answering, which was itself an answer of some kind. Silas watched him go and then turned Odessa north and rode. He pushed harder on the way back. The papers against his chest felt heavier than their actual weight, which was not a physical sensation, but a responsibility one. The feeling of carrying something that had cost lives to create and could cost more to deliver. He rode through the short winter daylight and into the early dark, stopping only to rest Odessa and eat something he barely tasted. And he was back at the ranch on the afternoon of the 4th day, coming over the north ridge and seeing the smoke from the chimney thin and straight in the cold air, and the small figure of Thomas at the east window who saw him and disappeared inside, and the door opening before he'd reached the yard. Danny was on his feet, not doing much with them. He was standing in the doorway with a blanket around his shoulders and his feet in Silas's spare wool socks, which were 6 sizes too large. But he was standing, and his color was real color, not fever color, and he looked at Silas coming across the yard with the frank, measuring expression that was becoming familiar. You got it? Danny said. I got it. Told you he would, Danny said to someone behind him, and went back inside. Thomas was at the door before Silas had Odessa tied, and he didn't ask about the documents right away, which told Silas something about how the 4 days had gone. There was something else first. He could see it in the boy's face. What happened? Silas said. Thomas glanced back into the cabin and then stepped out and pulled the door part way. 2 nights ago a rider came through, didn't come to the cabin. I don't think he saw it, or if he did, he didn't think it was worth stopping. But he was on the south ridge for about an hour. He paused. And yesterday morning, May found boot prints around the north side of the barn. Silas felt the familiar settling of alarm into assessment. Just prints? Nothing else? Just prints. But they're not from any of us, and they're not from Hodder or the other 2. I checked, and they're still where you left them. Thomas met his gaze steadily. Someone was here, someone who decided not to knock. Silas looked at the south ridge, pale and still in the afternoon light. A scout, he said. Boone's changed tactics. He doesn't know what happened to his men, so he's not sending a group anymore. He's sending someone to look first. He thought about the timing, which means we have less time than I'd planned. Inside, Evelyn was waiting. She had the patience of someone who had spent the last 4 days doing specific, practical things. He could see it in the cabin, which was tidier than he'd left it. Certain items he'd left loose now organized. A tear in the east window's shutter repaired with a strip of leather. a pot of something on the fire that smelled better than anything that had existed in his kitchen previously. She saw him come in, and she looked at his coat, and he took the papers out and set them on the table, and she put her hand on them without opening them, just for a moment, like confirming they were real. Then she looked at him. "You're all right." "Yes." "Your arm?" He'd forgotten about the graze. "Fine." She looked at him a moment longer in that direct, assessing way she had, and he understood that she'd spent 4 days in some version of calculating odds, and the odds had come out different various times. And now he was here, and the papers were on the table, and the calculation was resolving into something she hadn't let herself assume. "We need to leave tomorrow," he said. "I know. Thomas told me about the ridge. Danny can ride?" "Danny could probably walk if I let him, which I won't." She looked toward the back room where the children were. "Clara's boot is done. I used a piece of the harness leather. May is—" She paused. "May is better. She's been talking, not a lot, but talking." She said this last part with a care that told him how much the silence had cost her. "And Ruth has decided you're her favorite person, which I want you to know I find completely inexplicable." "Kids usually like me," Silas said. "Adults take longer." She looked at him for a moment, and something moved across her face that was almost amusement, and then she went back to the fire and said, over her shoulder, "Sit down, eat something." He sat. He ate. It was the best meal he'd had in longer than he could account for, and he didn't ask what she'd put in it because the answer probably involved creative use of the things on his sparsely populated shelf, and he'd rather not know the specifics. After, when the children were asleep and Thomas was on watch, he and Evelyn sat at the table with the papers between them and went through them by firelight. It took 2 hours. Randall Holt had been meticulous in the way of a man who had decided late in life to do the right thing and wanted to make sure it stuck. The deed transfers were there, 7 of them, covering properties across 3 counties, all with signatures that Thomas had been right about. Comparing them against legitimate records Holt had included, the forgeries were good but not perfect, the kind of thing a court examiner would catch in an afternoon. The correspondence between Boone and his land broker in Cheyenne was worse, in the direct, incriminating language of men who believed their letters were private. They discussed specific targets, specific timelines, and in 2 cases, specific methods. The list of names Holt had compiled covered 11 people over 4 years. 11 people. Evelyn read that page and set it down and did not pick it up again. "Randall Holt knew about this for how long?" she said. Her voice was quiet and controlled. "I don't know. Long enough to document it. And he came to me." She was looking at the table. "He came to me because I was nobody, because I was safe to tell." She paused. "And instead I was the easiest person to blame." "Yes," Silas said. He didn't soften it. "He didn't mean for that to happen," she said. It was not defensive. She was working through it, placing it correctly in her own understanding. "He didn't think it would go that far." "People rarely do," Silas said. She was quiet for a while. The fire settled. Outside the wind had picked up and was making the loose shutter on the east window bang, and Silas made a mental note to fix it, and then remembered it was already fixed, and then sat with the small, strange warmth of that fact. "Tell me about the judge in Laramie," Evelyn said. So he did. He told her about Harlan Price, who had been a federal deputy the same year Silas became a marshal, and who had moved into territorial law with more ambition than Silas had and more success than he'd expected. He told her that Price was not a sentimental man, and not a man who did favors for reasons of friendship, but that he took land fraud seriously because he had grown up on land that had been taken from his family through a legal mechanism that his father had never had the resources to challenge, and that this specific history had given Price a bone-deep commitment to legitimate property law that went beyond professional obligation. "He'll take the case?" Evelyn asked. "He'll look at the documents," Silas said. "That's all I can promise. After that, it's the evidence and your testimony and Thomas's testimony that do the work." She absorbed this. "How far is Laramie?" "From here 3 days if the weather holds, probably 4. And if Boone's men get ahead of us, then we deal with that when it happens." He looked at her. "I'd rather get ahead of them." She nodded. She looked at the papers for a moment and then began to refold them carefully, the way she'd done everything in the last few days, with quiet, deliberate competence, not fast, not dramatic. She tied them back with the kitchen string. Silas, she said, without looking up. Yeah, in Black Hollow, before all of this. She smoothed the string with one finger. What kind of life were you building? Up here. He looked at the fire. It was a fair question and not one he'd expected. A quiet one, he said. Small, contained. He paused. I'd made some mistakes earlier. I wanted something that had fewer moving parts. She looked up then. What kind of mistakes? He was quiet for a moment. The fire was the only sound. I was a marshal for 11 years, he said. I was good at it. And then I made a decision I was wrong, about a man. I was certain he was guilty and I pushed the case and he wasn't, and by the time that was clear he stopped. He lost 3 years. His wife had left. His kids were grown and gone, and I had been so sure. He looked at his hands on the table. After that I kept marshalling for 2 more years and I was still good at it, but I was never certain about anything again, and you can't do that work without a certain amount of certainty, so I stopped. Evelyn was watching him. I came up here, he said, built that cabin. Decided what I needed was less. He paused. A cow seemed like the right amount of something to be responsible for. She was quiet for a moment. And instead you got us, she said. No self-pity in it, just the observation. Instead I got you, he agreed. She held his gaze and he held hers, and there was nothing to add to that, which was fine, because some things land better without an addition. They left the next morning before light. All 5 children, Odessa and the Gray, whose lameness had improved to the point of manageable, and Silas and Evelyn on foot for the flatter stretches to spare the horses, and the papers against Silas's chest and the Winchester across his saddle. The cold was brutal in the pre-dawn dark, the kind that got into the seams of things, and Ruth cried for the first 10 minutes and then fell asleep on Evelyn's back, and May walked without complaint, and Danny rode sitting tall with the exaggerated straightness of a recovering child who wants to demonstrate he is fine. They were 6 miles out when Thomas, riding behind Silas, said quietly, 3 riders. Behind us. Coming fast. Silas turned. 3 riders, maybe a mile and a half back, moving at a canter on the open ground south of the tree line. Not cautious, not scouting, coming with purpose. He looked at the terrain ahead, a long, flat stretch, then a rise of broken country about 2 miles north, the kind of ground that slowed horses and gave options. 2 miles. Thomas, he said, take Odessa and get your mother and the children to that broken ground ahead. Don't wait for me. Move. Thomas looked at the riders and back at Silas. What are you going to do? Slow them down, Silas said. He took the Winchester out of the scabbard and handed Odessa's reins to the boy. Thomas looked at him with that face again, complicated, heavy, not a boy's face and not yet a man's, something caught between. Don't get shot, he said. Working on it, Silas said. He turned and started walking back south into the open ground, toward 3 riders who were coming hard and had not yet seen him step out from the group because the light was still low and gray and the distance was working in his favor for another 60 seconds. He used the 60 seconds. He found a shallow depression in the frozen ground, more suggestion than cover, and got down into it and got the Winchester settled, and he waited, and he did not think about the ranch or the papers, or the woman walking north with 5 children behind him, and he did not think about the man he'd once been wrong about, and he did not think about Laramie or what came after. He thought about the front sight. He thought about the distance. He thought about the cold, which was making his trigger finger stiff, and he moved it deliberately to loosen it. The riders came on. When they were close enough that he could see the lead rider's face, not Boone, not anyone he recognized, just a man doing a job he'd been paid to do, Silas put a shot 6 feet in front of the lead horse's hooves into the frozen ground, where it kicked up ice and dirt and made a sound like the end of patience. All 3 horses stopped. All 3 riders pulled up and looked around, trying to locate the shot. And in that looking, they lost 15 seconds. And 15 seconds was all Silas needed to relocate 20 yards right and get down again. And when they looked toward where he'd been, he was already somewhere else. He fired again, closer this time, and one of the horses reared. The 3 riders conferred. He could see the conversation without hearing it. The calculation, the same calculation Bud had made and Clem Hodder had made, the one that compared the pay against the outcome. 2 of the riders began to pull back. The 3rd held for a moment, looking at the open ground around him, understanding that he could not see the shooter and the shooter could clearly see him. Then the third rider pulled back too. Silas lay in the frozen depression and waited to see if they'd regroup and come again. They didn't. They pulled back past the point he could see them, and he gave it another 10 minutes, and they didn't come back. He stood up. His knees protested. His forearm throbbed where the graze had stiffened in the cold. He turned north and started walking toward the broken country, toward Thomas and Evelyn and 5 children and a set of papers that had cost Randall Holt his life and nearly cost Evelyn hers, and he walked steadily in the gray morning light, not fast, not slow, just 1 foot after the other across the frozen Wyoming ground. When he came over the first rise of the broken country, he could see them ahead, stopped and waiting. And Thomas saw him first and said something to his mother, and Evelyn turned. She was too far away for him to read her expression, but she didn't look away, and he kept walking, and the distance between them closed the way distances do when both people are staying put. Laramie was still 3 days north. The papers were still against his chest. And somewhere behind him, Edgar Boone was running out of men willing to take the job. The last 3 days to Laramie were not kind, but they were survivable, which was the most any of them asked of anything anymore. The broken country north of the ranch gave way to open plain on the second day, and the open plain gave them wind, the kind of wind that comes across Wyoming flatland with nothing to slow it for 60 miles and arrives with a personal grievance. Ruth stopped crying eventually, not because she was warm, but because she ran out of the energy for it, and Evelyn carried her for 6 hours straight without mentioning that her arms had gone from aching to something past aching. Silas noticed and said nothing, because Evelyn would not accept the observation as anything other than an implication that she couldn't manage. And she could manage, she was managing, and pointing it out would cost more than it was worth. Danny rode the full second day without complaint, which was either genuine recovery or an 11-year-old's performance of recovery. And Silas suspected it was some of both. The boy had the particular stubbornness of someone who had been helpless for too long and was done with the experience, which Silas understood completely. On the morning of the third day, May spoke 17 words in a row. Silas counted because the count seemed important. She was walking beside him on the flat ground east of the tree line, and she said, without preamble, "The snow is different here than back home. It's drier. It doesn't pack right for snowballs." She said it the way children sometimes say things, not to start a conversation, just to deposit an observation in the world and see what it did there. "You're right," Silas said. "Too cold. Needs to be a little above freezing to pack." "That's inconvenient," May said. "It is," he agreed. She didn't say anything else for another 2 miles, but she walked close to him, close enough that their arms occasionally brushed, and he understood that this was its own kind of conversation. Claire had been watching all of this from a few paces back, and when Silas glanced at her, she gave him the look that had stopped surprising him. That complicated, layered look that said she saw considerably more than anyone gave her credit for, and that she had opinions about it, and that she would share those opinions if and when she decided the time was right, and not before. He was learning to respect that about her. They came into Laramie on the afternoon of the third day, all 7 of them road-worn and underfed, and carrying the particular exhaustion that settles into bones rather than muscle, the kind that sleep helps but doesn't fully fix. The town was bigger than Black Hollow by several degrees, a territorial capital in practice if not in official designation, with a proper hotel, 2 banks, a post office with a telegraph, and a courthouse that had been built by people who intended it to last. Silas brought them to the hotel first. He had $12 left. He spent 8 of them on 2 rooms without apologizing to himself about it, because the alternative was arriving at Harlan Price's office with 5 children who smelled like a week of hard travel and looked like exactly what they were. And first impressions in legal proceedings were not nothing. He left Evelyn with the children and a bar of soap and the instruction to take as long as they needed, and he went to find Price. The territorial judge's office was on the 2nd floor of the courthouse, up a staircase that was solid and well-maintained in the way that things are when they've been built to impress and have managed it. A clerk outside the office told Silas that Judge Price was in session and would be unavailable until 4 o'clock, and Silas said he'd wait, and he sat in the wooden chair outside the office for 2 hours with the papers on his lap and the Winchester leaning against the wall beside him, and the clerk glanced at the rifle periodically and said nothing. Price came out of his office at 4:15 and stopped when he saw Silas. Harlan Price was 53 years old and had the build of a man who had once been physical and had moved into sedentary work without entirely accepting it. still wide in the shoulders, still standing with the weight-forward posture of someone who expects resistance. He had a gray beard he kept clipped close, and eyes the color of creek water that saw things in the specific, categorizing way of someone who had spent years making decisions based on incomplete information and had gotten good at locating what mattered. He looked at Silas for a long moment. "Granger," he said. Not warmly, not coldly. Just the name, with the weight of their history behind it, which was a history that contained multitudes. "Harlan," Silas said. He stood up. "I need an hour." "You look terrible." "I need an hour anyway." Price looked at the papers in Silas's hand, at the rifle against the wall, at Silas's face, and he stepped back and opened his office door. He got more than an hour. He got 2.5 hours, because Price was the kind of man who did not skim, who read every page of Holt's documentation twice, who asked questions that were specific and technical and occasionally difficult, and who listened to Silas's account of Black Hollow, and the hanging, and the riders, and the siege at the ranch, with the careful, unreadable expression of a judge processing evidence rather than a man hearing a story. At the end of it, Price sat back in his chair and looked at the documents spread across his desk. "Thomas Mercer," he said. "The boy. He was present. He saw it happen. He's 14. He is. He's also the steadiest 14-year-old I've encountered, and I've encountered a few." Price looked at him. "And the woman, Evelyn Mercer." Holt came to her specifically. She's a direct witness to what he told her, which is hearsay. In combination with forged documents and the testimony of a child who watched Boone administer poison, it's the context that makes the rest of it make sense. Silas met Price's gaze. "You know what's here, Harlan. You've been reading it for 2 hours." Price was quiet. He tapped one finger on the edge of the desk once, twice. "Edgar Boone has been a territorial judge for 6 years," he said. "He has connections in Cheyenne. He has a land broker who will have his own lawyers. Taking this to a formal hearing means—" "I know what it means," Silas said. "I'm asking if you'll do it." Another silence. Price looked at the papers. "Where is he now?" Price said. "Boone. In Black Hollow. He doesn't know we made it here. He sent riders. The last group turned back 2 days ago." Silas paused. "He'll know soon. His men who didn't come back will talk eventually. I'd estimate we have 4 or 5 days before he understands what's happened and starts working on his response." Price nodded slowly. "I'll need to send deputies to Black Hollow tonight. Yes. And I'll need to take formal statements from the Mercer woman and the boy before I can issue any warrants." "They're at the hotel. They're ready." Price looked at him with something that was half exasperation and half something else. Something that Silas had seen in Price's face before years ago, on a different case. On the day Silas had come to him with a situation that was wrong in ways the law didn't have clean categories for. It was the look of a man who had built a career on the precise application of rules, and was now being asked to care about the human beings those rules were supposed to serve. "You look terrible," Price said again. "You said that." "I'm saying it again because I want you to know I see it." Price gathered the papers carefully and set them in an even stack. "When this is over, Granger, you're going to sit down and eat a real meal and sleep in an actual bed for more than 2 hours." "That sounds good," Silas said. "It's an order, not a suggestion." "All right," Silas said. And because it was Price, and because they had 11 years of understanding between them that didn't require sentiment to be real. "Thank you, Harlan." Price picked up the papers and stood. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Thank me after." The formal statements took 3 days. Thomas went first, alone with Price and a court recorder, and Silas waited outside with the younger children and tried to read the faces of the people who passed through the courthouse without much success. When Thomas came out, he was pale but composed, the same controlled pallor he'd had at the hanging, and he sat down beside Silas and stared at the floor for a few minutes without talking. Then he said, "He believed me." "I know he would," Silas said. "You couldn't have known that." "I knew enough about him to think it was likely," Silas said. "That's the most anyone knows about anything." Thomas looked at him sideways. "You're not a very reassuring person." "No," Silas agreed. "I know." The ghost of something, almost a smile, crossed the boy's face and was gone. Evelyn's statement took longer because what she had to give was more layered. Not just what Holt had told her, but the 8 days in custody, the conditions, the absence of any legitimate legal proceeding, the morning of the hanging itself. When she came out, she did not look at anyone for a moment, just stood in the courthouse hallway with her hand on the wall, and Silas moved the children back slightly to give her 5 seconds to herself. She collected herself with the same quiet efficiency she'd applied to everything else. Then she looked at him and nodded once. Done, functional, ready for what came next. What came next was the arrest of Edgar Boone. Price sent 4 deputies to Black Hollow, which was enough. Boone had not believed until the very last moment that the Mercer woman had survived, had gotten out, had gotten to Laramie, had handed over documents that he'd spent 6 years convinced didn't exist or couldn't be located. The deputies found him in his courthouse, in his courtroom, sitting at his bench as if the bench were still a defense. It wasn't. They brought him to Laramie in chains, and he passed through the territorial courthouse entrance on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks after the hanging that didn't happen, and the Mercer children were in the upstairs hallway when he passed below. Ruth did not understand what she was seeing. Danny watched with his jaw tight. May looked, and then looked away. Clara did not look away, and her face was the settled, serious face she'd worn throughout, resolute without being hard. Thomas watched Boone walk in chains across the courthouse floor below, and he said nothing, and his face did nothing that Silas could read. Silas stood beside him at the railing. "How does it feel?" Thomas asked, without taking his eyes off Boone. "Watching it?" "All of it." The boy paused. "You did this. You're the one who saw it," Silas said. "Your mother's the one who stood under that rope. Holt's the one who spent years building the evidence at the risk of his life." He looked at Thomas. "I bought a cow." Thomas looked at him, and this time the almost smile became an actual one, small and crooked and real, and it fit the boy's face better than anything Silas had seen there yet. "You never got the cow," Thomas said. "Never got the cow," Silas confirmed. The trial of Edgar Boone took 11 days. It was not a comfortable 11 days. Boone's lawyer was a man from Cheyenne named Aldrich, who was good at his job in the specific way that people are good at jobs when they are paid enough and have no conscience about application, and he did what lawyers do. He attacked the credibility of the witnesses, the chain of custody of the documents, the legitimacy of Holt's record-keeping. He pointed out that Thomas Mercer was a child with a reason to lie. He pointed out that Evelyn Mercer was a woman who had been facing execution and had every incentive to construct a story. He said these things in the calm, methodical tone of a man who does not need to be right, only to create doubt. Evelyn took the stand on the 4th day. She sat in the witness chair and she looked at the courtroom, at the jury, at the lawyers, at Boone sitting 15 feet away at the defense table, and she did not look at Silas, which he understood. She did not need to look at him. She knew exactly where she was and exactly what she was doing, and she did not need an anchor. Boone's lawyer spent 40 minutes trying to unsettle her. She answered every question in the same even, precise voice. She did not embellish. She did not get angry, or rather, she was angry. Silas could see it in the set of her jaw, and the way her hands were very still in her lap. But she did not let the anger do anything the lawyer could use. She told the jury what Randall Holt had told her, word by word, as clearly as she'd kept it in her memory through 8 days of custody and a near hanging and 3 days of hard riding across frozen country. She told it like a woman who had decided the truth was what she had, and it was enough, and she was going to deliver it completely. When Aldrich suggested that perhaps her recollection of Holt's words had been influenced by her subsequent experience, by her fear, by her children, by the desire for a story that explained everything, Evelyn looked at him for a moment. "Mr. Aldrich," she said, "I have been cold, sick, shot at, and almost hanged. My children have walked across frozen ground with holes in their boots and slept in a root cellar. My 11-year-old son nearly died of fever." She paused. "I have had a great deal of time to think about whether I was remembering what Randall Holt told me correctly. I am." The courtroom was very quiet. Aldrich moved on. Thomas testified the following day, and he was, as Silas had said to Price, steady. The steadiest 14-year-old in Wyoming, possibly. He described what he had seen through the barn wall gap with a specificity that was unassailable. The particular cup, the color of the bottle, the words he'd heard Boone speak, the exact progression of Randall Holt's condition in the minutes afterward. He described it in the flat, careful tone of someone who had been carrying the description for weeks and had kept it intact through sheer determination. Aldrich tried. He pointed out that the barn was dark. that Thomas had been outside in the cold, that a frightened boy's perception could not be. "I wasn't frightened," Thomas said. "I was outside checking a rabbit trap. I didn't know what I was seeing until it was too late to do anything about it. That's different from being frightened." Aldrich paused. "You watched a man die and you didn't seek help?" Thomas looked at him steadily. "I was 14 years old and I had just watched the territorial judge poison a man in his own kitchen. I went home and I tried to figure out who I could tell that Boone couldn't get to first. While I was figuring that out, they arrested my mother." He paused. "There wasn't anyone." The jury was out for less than 4 hours. Silas was in the courthouse hallway when the verdict came, sitting on the same wooden chair he'd sat in outside Price's office, and Evelyn was beside him, not touching, just beside him the way she'd been beside him at the fire that first night at the ranch. The children were in the hotel across the street with a woman from the courthouse staff who had taken an interest and offered to sit with them, which Clara had accepted on behalf of everyone with the diplomatic competence she applied to most things. When the doors opened and the clerk came out with the look that a clerk gets when the verdict is unambiguous, Evelyn did not say anything. She reached over and put her hand on Silas's arm, not squeezing, not gripping, just resting there. And he looked down at her hand and did not move. And they sat like that while the clerk went past to get Price, and the jury filed out, and somewhere inside the courtroom, Edgar Boone heard 11 words that ended everything he'd built. Guilty on all counts. The land broker in Cheyenne was arrested 6 days later based on the correspondence in Holt's documents. 3 of the forged property transfers were invalidated and the properties returned to the heirs of the people who'd been killed for them. The names on Holt's list, 11 people, 4 years, became the basis of a wider investigation that went beyond what any of them had initially expected. Some of those cases would resolve. Some wouldn't. That was the nature of justice in the territory, which was real and imperfect and better than the alternative. Boone got 22 years. He was 58 years old when the sentence was read. The math on that was not something Silas dwelled on. They stayed in Laramie for 2 weeks after the trial, partly because the children needed the rest, and partly because Price wanted Silas available for the ongoing investigation, and partly because nobody had actually decided what came next. The 2 weeks had the quality of in-between time, neither the emergency of before nor the settled shape of what would follow. Silas rented a small house on the edge of town, nothing much, 2 bedrooms and a stove, and a yard that the children immediately treated as their personal territory, and he slept in it and ate in it and existed in it with the mild, slightly dazed quality of a man who has been moving toward something for a long time and has now arrived and is still internally in motion. Ruth had begun calling him by name, which she'd been doing for a while, but now she'd dropped the mister. Just Silas. She said it constantly and without apparent meaning, the way small children use a name to assert that a person is real and present and accounted for. May had started talking again in the full, ordinary way. Not hesitant, not in 17-word increments. She talked about the snow in Laramie and about a dog she'd seen outside the post office and about what she wanted to plant in the spring if they had a garden. And she talked in the easy, rolling way of a child who has been quiet for longer than she meant to be and is making up for it. Danny's fever had been fully gone for a week and a half, and his first act upon complete recovery had been to find the weakest spot in the yard fence and widen it into something he could squeeze through, which Silas discovered when he came around the corner and found Danny on the wrong side of it, looking thoughtful. "Needs to be fixed," Silas said. "I know," Danny said. "I'll fix it." He did fix it too. Not perfectly. The boards were slightly uneven and the wire he'd used to reinforce it was the wrong gauge. But it held, and he'd done it himself, and he hadn't mentioned it to anyone in advance or afterward, just done it and moved on. Silas found himself thinking about that fence for a while. Claire had begun helping with the household in ways that were useful without being the kind of compulsive helpfulness that comes from insecurity. She helped because she was organized and had opinions about how things should be arranged, and she sometimes moved Silas's things to better locations and informed him afterward with a tone that expected no argument. He generally agreed she'd put them in better places. He didn't say so, but she knew. She had the particular quality of knowing. On the 11th day, Evelyn found him fixing the stove's loose flue in the early morning, before the children were up, and she brought him coffee, real coffee, from the general store, and sat on the back step while he worked. He didn't say anything, and neither did she for a while. Thomas wants to study law, she said eventually. Silas looked up from the flu. Does he? He decided somewhere around the third day of the trial. He told me last night. She held her coffee cup in both hands. He says if there are going to be men like Boone, there need to be more men who can use the law against them rather than with them. Silas thought about the boy on the witness stand, 14 years old and unshakable. He'd be good at it, he said. I know. She paused. He'll need schooling, real schooling, not what I can do at home. She looked at the yard, at the fence Danny had mended. A lot of things are going to need to be figured out. Yes, Silas said. The property in Black Hollow is mine. It was always mine. It's in my husband's name and my name both, and Boone never got the transfer through before all of this. So I have land, she paused. Not a lot, but it's there. That's something, Silas said. And she was quiet. He kept working on the flu, which was not fully cooperating, and the coffee she'd brought him sat on the step beside her, going from hot to warm. Silas, she said. He looked at her. She held his gaze. There was morning light on her face, and the bruise on her cheekbone had been gone for a week, and she looked, in the particular plainness of early morning without pretense, like exactly what she was. A woman who had been through something that would have finished most people, who had not been finished, who was now sitting on a back step deciding what the next part looked like. What do you want? She asked. Direct, the way she asked everything. He thought about the cow he hadn't bought and the narrow, contained life he'd been building, the one with fewer moving parts. He thought about the ranch up near the Laramie foothills, and the loose shutter that got fixed, and the trapdoor he'd built alone one rainy October afternoon for reasons that had turned out to matter. He thought about Ruth saying his name like an assertion of reality, and May's 17 words about snowballs, and the fence Danny fixed himself with the wrong gauge wire. I want to go back to the ranch, he said. She waited. There's enough room, he said. It's not much, but there's the lean-to and I can build out. I've been meaning to extend the east wall for 2 years and haven't gotten to it, and the pasture is decent. And he stopped, because he was cataloging practical facts to avoid the actual thing he was saying, and they both knew it, and he was a man who had asked for directness and owed it in return. I want you to come back with me, he said. All of you, if that's what you want. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. She did the thing she always did when she was deciding something, held very still, let the decision settle into its actual weight before she spoke. It's a long way from Black Hollow, she said. Yes. Thomas would need to get to a school. Laramie's a day's ride. There's a school here that Price could... I know, she said. I'm not looking for reasons why it won't work. I'm looking at what needs to be figured out. A pause. There's a difference. I know there is, he said. She looked at the yard, at the mended fence, at the winter light on the dry grass. I'm not the same person I was a month ago, she said quietly. Not as a warning, just as a true thing that needed to be said. What happened to me? What I let happen to me? What I sat in that cell and... She stopped. I blame myself for a long time. For walking into it. For not seeing Boone for what he was sooner. For not protecting my children from... She shook her head. I'm not doing that anymore. I know that's not... I know I couldn't have... She stopped again and this time let the sentence go rather than force it to an ending. But I'm not the same. I know, Silas said. And you're not... She looked at him. You carry things. From before. That man you were wrong about. That's still in you. Yes. That's not an accusation. I know it isn't. I'm saying... She paused. I'm saying I see it, and I'm not asking you to be finished with it. I'm just saying I see it. I was quiet for a moment. The flu was forgotten. The coffee on the step had gone cold. Nobody ever said that to me before, he said. Not moved by it exactly. It landed differently than that. It landed like something being set down rather than something being given. Well, Evelyn said, now someone has. She picked up his coffee from the step and handed it to him. He took it. They sat there in the early morning while the town woke around them and the children slept inside, and the day opened up ahead of them with all its unresolved questions and practical problems and genuine uncertainties. He did not ask her again, and she did not answer yet, but the question was between them like something with weight, like something that would still be there when they were ready to pick it up together. Spring came to the Laramie foothills in early April. It came the way spring comes to that country. Not gradually, not apologetically, but in a rush. The snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, and then the flat ground going from white to brown to the particular tentative green that looks almost impossible after enough months of white. The creek behind the ranch ran high and fast and cold, and the pasture ground softened enough to work. And the east wall extension that Silas had been meaning to build for 2 years got built, with Thomas swinging a hammer beside him and Danny fetching lumber with the erratic enthusiasm of someone who wants to be useful and hasn't yet learned to pace it, and Clara directing the placement of the new window from the ground below with the calm authority of someone who had thought it through more carefully than anyone else. Evelyn had planted 3 rows of kitchen garden along the south face of the cabin in the first week of April, working in the cold morning ground with the methodical patience she brought to everything. Ruth followed her up and down the rows at a pace just slightly too slow to be helpful and just slightly too earnest to be sent away. May had found 2 cats somewhere. Silas was not entirely clear on the transaction. They were barn cats and they were efficient at their function, and May named them both before anyone could object, and the naming made them permanent, which May had known when she started the naming. Danny had negotiated a new fence project, an actual proper fence for the pasture, something the ranch had needed since before Silas built it, and was working through it post by post with a seriousness that made the wrong gauge wire of the first fence seem like ancient history. On a Tuesday evening in late April, with the light going gold and low across the pasture and the smell of turned earth coming through the open cabin door, Thomas came and sat beside Silas on the front step. They sat without talking for a while, watching the light work on the hills. "I've been thinking about Holt," Thomas said. "Yeah?" "He hid those documents in the worst man's building in the territory." Thomas paused. "That was either very brave or very strange." "Maybe both," Silas said. "Some things are." Thomas turned that over. "You think he knew it would end this way? That someone would find them?" Silas thought about Randall Holt, a 63-year-old man who had watched 4 years of crime and had finally decided the watching was worse than the acting, who had chosen a woman he trusted and told her the truth, and then gone home and been killed for it. "I think he hoped," Silas said. "I don't think he knew." Thomas nodded. "There's a difference." "There is." The boy was quiet again. Then, "I want to do the law thing. I wasn't just saying it, I've been thinking about it every day." "I know," Silas said. "Price said he could write a letter to the school here." "I heard." Thomas looked at him. "Will you—" He stopped. Started again with the careful honesty that was his particular quality. "You don't have to. I know you didn't sign up for any of this. I know you came to buy a cow and instead you got—" He gestured at the cabin, the children, the fence, the cats, all of it. "Thomas," Silas said. "Yeah. I got a better deal." The boy looked at him for a moment with an expression that was 14 and trying not to be young and failing just slightly at the edges, the way people do when they've been trying to be old for too long and something makes them forget. He looked away at the hills. "Okay," he said quietly. Inside the cabin, Evelyn was moving in the lamplight, doing something at the table, and Ruth was probably underfoot, and the sound of the cats doing whatever cats did at this hour was audible through the open door. And somewhere around the east side, Danny was still working on his fence despite the failing light, because Danny had a relationship with reasonable stopping points that was ongoing and unresolved. Silas looked at all of it. He thought about the life he'd been building before. The contained one, the manageable one, the one with no more moving parts than he could keep track of alone. He'd been so deliberate about it, so careful to keep the edges defined. He'd told himself it was wisdom, and maybe it was. The specific wisdom of a man who had been wrong once in a way that cost something real and didn't want to be wrong like that again. But there was a kind of being wrong that came not from too much certainty, but from too little willingness. The wrong of the 200 people who had watched and looked at the ground and gone home for supper. He had not been that kind of wrong. He had ridden into Black Hollow looking for something simple, and something else had asked him what he was made of, and he had answered. He had answered, and here was the answer. There was nothing clean about it. Thomas still carried the image of what he'd seen through a barn wall gap, and probably would for a long time. May still sometimes went quiet without warning, And when she did, Clara moved closer without commenting on it. Danny's fence would need fixing in 6 places before the summer was out. Evelyn woke sometimes before light with the particular shallow breathing of someone whose body remembered a rope. And on those mornings, Silas made coffee and left it near wherever she was sitting without saying anything about it, which was the best he knew how to do. Nobody was finished with anything. That was the honest accounting of it. There was no version of what they'd been through that resolved cleanly into wholeness. The wholeness they were building was the kind built from pieces that had been broken, which meant it had seams, and the seams showed, and that was simply what it was. Evelyn came to the door. She looked out at him on the step, and at Thomas beside him, and at the gold light on the hills, and she leaned against the door frame the way she'd been leaning against things since the first morning at the ranch, with a particular quality of resting that was not carelessness but choice, the choice of a woman who had learned in the hardest possible way that rest was not weakness. "Supper," she said. Thomas got up and went inside. Silas stayed on the step a moment longer. He looked at the pasture. At the fence, Danny was building post by post. At the green coming up in the kitchen garden rows. At the hill to the south where the road to Laramie disappeared over the ridge, and the road to Black Hollow went further and further into a past that was not gone but was becoming, slowly, the past. He thought about a milk cow. He thought he might still get one. He went inside.